So let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum, designed by the MIT Mobility Initiative. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. I'm really excited today to have Adam Grosser, Chairman of UP.Partner, to join us and share the Moving World Report 2025, Innovation, Geopolitics, and Road Ahead. The official launch date of the report is actually March 10th. We actually got an early peek 3 days ahead of time. So that's quite a treat for the MIT Mobility Forum member here today. So before I start the forum, I do want to emphasize the norm of this forum, which is for everyone, here specifically referred to the audience, to contribute one idea, either in the form of a question to Adam or a comment to his presentation. You can type your thought directly into the chat. Also, to warm up the audience a little bit, I will invite everybody to type into the chat your organization, your local city, and the local time. So I would say MIT, Cambridge, MA, 12 now. In that way, we can give Adam a sense of who's in the audience here today. We have Denzel, Seattle DOE, Texas Transportation Institute, Chicago Transit Authority, U of T, San Carlos. Great, yeah, thank you. Yeah, please keep typing your role, location, and time into that. Well, let me introduce Adam here. As I sent the link to Adam before, but you can see this is really a colorful person. It's really hard to summarize in like 1 minute or so. Adam described himself first as an operator, then as an entrepreneur, and in the last 24 years as an investor. He's now the chairman and managing partner of Partner, which is early stage venture capital fund. I also serve as a senior advisor to the Canadian Pension Plan Advisory Board and on the board of First Reserve's energy platform. First Reserve is the oldest and largest private equity firm designated to energy. I also serve on the board of Carbon, Line Vision, a Google project, and also on the advisory board of Beta Technology. Before founding a partner, there was a group head of Silver Lake, a global technology investment firm with approximately $75 billion asset under management, invests in the area of energy, automation, mobility, and data communication sectors. Successful companies include Tesla, SolarCity, Highland Mobile, Quorum, and Ares, etc. And he was also a general partner at Foundation Capital for 10 years. I was named to the Forbes Midas list, which is the world's best venture capital investor list 4 times. And before his investor and startup life, Adam held the leadership position at Apple, when Apple was called Apple Computers, still Lucasfilm, and Sony, working with people like Steve Jobs and George Lucas. Such a luxury experience to have working with those talents there. Yeah. And beside his professional life, Adam builds boats and planes, bike avidly, kite surf whenever possible. He's an ATP-rated pilot, which is the highest level certification in the United States, and actively in restoration, preservation, and flying of jet warbirds. Actually, let me show a few pictures that this is actually the project that Adam personally involved in, building all sorts of technologies in mobility, as you can see there, right? Last year, of course, Adam is the senior fellow of MIT Mobility Initiative 2025 cohort. Last time, to summarize, nothing gives Adam more satisfaction than assisting exceptional founding team to achieve their goals and change the status quo. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Adam, please.
Okay, Jinhua. Well, thank you, everybody. It's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. That hyperbolic introduction notwithstanding, I will do my best to tell you a little bit about what we're up to and share some data that I think is, if nothing else, provocative. So the reason that I co-founded up with a couple of great friends 5 years ago was to transform the moving world. And the realization was that mobility really was suffering from an innovation crisis. It's the largest contributor to greenhouse gases on every inhabited continent. It's the most difficult to decarbonize. And there was no one singular firm focused on trying to ameliorate some of these considerations. So we sat down and thought about a tagline, and our vision was to move people and goods cleaner, faster, safer, with lower impact on land, sea, air, and space. And we decided to build a very unconventional firm. So I know this talk is not about UP, but just to contextualize what you're about to see, we do three things. We have a group of folks that invests in companies. We have a very large group of folks that builds companies. We create 10 companies a year in conjunction with the largest firms in mobility, such as Porsche, for example. And then the third activity is that we create physical and intellectual communities. And as such, one of the things we publish is sort of the moral analog of what Mary Meeker used to do for the internet. We publish something called the Moving World Report, which is really our reflections on the trends of the last 12 months that are shaping the industry that might not be immediately obvious if you're sitting in a day-to-day environment. It's sometimes hard to sort of see the macro for the trees. So as Jinhua said, this is going to be released a few days from now. So what you're actually seeing is an excerpt, and I'm going to blitz through some of it, but this is about a quarter of the content of the actual full report. So as such, as I excerpted material to make this talk today, it's a little disjointed. So a lot of, perhaps some of the conclusions are perhaps less obvious, and I'll try and touch on them. There's whole entire sections, for example, such as AI and maritime, that have been excluded, and some of the summary, documents at the end of the report that sort of symbolize what we're trying to accomplish aren't included. But I hope you find it interesting, thought-provoking, and with that, I will start to walk you through some of what we're thinking about and how it's informing our decisions to invest or build. So we actually believe that there's a resurgence of interest in the kinds of things that we all work on, from robotics to automation to new forms of maritime transport, electric aviation, energy, and obviously compute. But there's some really weird things going on if you step back and look around the world, that we are actually, if you survey people and look at data, we're in a really kind of weird, particularly in the US, cycle of pessimism. And if you look at the chart on the left, which is sort of the frequency of words searched on caution, worry, and risk versus, say, progress in the future, you can see this idea that people are worrying more and they're thinking a little bit less about the optimistic future. And secondarily, on the right, what you're seeing is 12th grader sentiment, and you can see that there's a large increase in sort of questioning the greater good and how things might evolve. And that is really concentrated in the West, by the way. So and there's more data behind this, but if you look at it, it's the developed world. It's definitely different in parts of the developing world where there's still a tremendous amount of optimism. This is a really interesting, again, macro perspective. If this is a sort of a hurricane diagram of election mobility through time, and the baseline bar at 0 is where the governing party stood. And if you look at the far right, every governing party that had an election in 2024 lost a vote share. And that is the first time in 70 years that this has occurred. So there is, I think, you could extrapolate this to say there's a global dissatisfaction with the status quo, whatever that happens to mean. So let's talk a little bit about how the economy is shaping up and how things are evolving. One of the things that has been, I think, a misguided trope in the West is that China is not an innovator, and I think what we've tracked is a variety of sectors that relate to transportation and mobility, ranging from UAVs to energy to fundamental manufacturing technologies, for the last 15 years and project forward a little bit. And China has moved from being behind in a lot of things, definitely a perhaps copycat, to fully competitive and in many cases a global leader. And I think that there is a reflection, and you'll see this in certain sectors, that China is actually leading in a variety of ways. And in fact, there's a really interesting chart that was put out by the Australian Policy Institute for Strategy that tracks 44 fundamental technologies. And as of the late 2024, China was leading in 37 of these 44 technologies that affect the ability to develop and deploy modern transportation and technologies. So, interesting macro data. At the same time, Europe has been incredibly stagnant, and disappointingly so. And this is basically 20 years of no growth. And it's really captured in the following slide, which shows companies formed in the last 50 years with market caps larger than $10 billion. And if you look at this, the center giant cluster of immense companies, and there's a scale of company on the left, is the United States. And the largest new company in Europe is Spotify, and it's dwarfed by quite literally tens of or hundreds of companies in the US. And I think what you're seeing when you talk to European investors is a cultural lack of willingness to take risk. Flipping forward to a couple of things that are near and dear to my heart, manufacturing. And one of the things that's interesting, if you look at absolute numbers, US is about half of China, 2.5 trillion versus 5 trillion. But what's really interesting is how much we lag as a percentage of GDP versus other industrialized countries. We are way, way, way down on that chart on the right. But it's pretty interesting what's happening at this very moment, which is, if you look again at the far right, reshoring and reindustrialization is dramatically higher than it's been in decades. And it's one of those things that we are tracking because it's super interesting. That said, there was a Wall Street Journal piece last week on shipbuilding where the US was roughly by tonnage, a 50th of capacity of Japan and about a 30th of capacity of Korea. And we were 5 times more expensive on a tonnage basis. So there's a lot of work to do if you really want to be back in the manufacturing game. Similarly, when I was chatting with some folks at Blue Origin about the size of the BE-4 engine that's on the New Glenn rocket, I asked them what precipitated the thrust constraints. And they said forging capacity in the United States, that you could no longer make parts that were commensurate, for example, with the size of the Saturn V back in 1972. So there's a lot of work to do. One of the things that we think is super interesting is humanoid robotics. And this is a field that is evolving at an insanely fast pace. And one of the things that you have to step back and think about, like, why are humanoids interesting? And they're interesting because of this sentence, because they can be deployed to the world as it is. We have mediated the world to be friendly to a bipedal, two-limbed morphology. And therefore, if you can create something that slots into the place that a person would slot, it's really interesting. And it's one of these technologies or one of these businesses that has benefited from a convergence of technologies. So you see autonomy and electrification and AI and materials and sensing and new forms of propulsive stuff, and of course the incredible decrease in cost in compute, it's come together that things that people like Boston Dynamics started 25 years ago, which were super hard, are actually remarkably easy. This is also really interesting, sort of what I'll call the biomimicry, where you have, in each of these pairs, you have a human being, a human X-ray on the left, and a clone robot on the right. And you look at sort of the design and the distribution of systems, and they are extraordinarily similar. And I think that's a really, really interesting development. And lest you think that this is sort of a dalliance by a few companies, there are over 60 humanoid robot companies at the moment. And one of the really, really, really startling things is the speed to functionality. It took 20 plus years for Boston Dynamics. Figure got a robot walking and doing useful things in about a year. On the far right, UCR, which stands for Under Control Robotics, they got a robot up doing useful work targeting the oil fields in less than 4 months. So this is a field that's evolving incredibly quickly. There is a company in China named Agibot. I think they're one of the real market leaders. They have deployed in commercial operations over 1,000 robots already. This is a really interesting thing because robots can fill in, they can fix demography in a large case. So if you think about an aging population or just a sheer number deficit, there are opportunities for humanoid robots to slot into a variety of places that can augment the U.S. and other population bases as they grow and change. There's a really fundamental economic reason as well. I mean, it's about $1 an hour to employ a humanoid, which is obviously far less than it would cost to employ a human being to do meaningful tasks that require some level of intelligence and dexterity. So, and that's today. I mean, you're seeing robots. I mean, a lot of the Chinese robotics companies are talking about, or are actively selling in the $30,000 to $40,000 per robot range today. I mean, that will only come down. Continuing this blitz, let's talk about space really quickly, and let's continue the theme of China. China has embraced privatized space. They've launched a tremendous number of rockets in 2024 with great success, including landing on the far side of the moon with a very successful lander. There are 2 companies that are recreating Starship in terms of functionality, down to launch towers with chopsticks to catch very large boosters coming back. And they broke the world record for a 9-hour spacewalk outside Tiangong. So this is a really, really interesting development where the Chinese government has embraced the private and augmented and supported the private space industry. And they are coming in a very, very meaningful way with sophisticated capabilities. You've probably seen charts like this. When I was a kid in the 1970s, it was staggeringly expensive to get a kilo of payload to orbit. And you can see that really in the last 5 years, it has dropped from on the order of $12,000 to with a Falcon Heavy, it's about $1,500. And Starship claims, if they can get it to work correctly, in the $200 per kilo range. And that mirrors, if you in large part, like the incredibly low cost, the sort of the same sort of curves in compute or in data storage. And I think it's transformative. Similarly, we've had sort of this Cambrian explosion of devices in low Earth orbit, and you're seeing incredible numbers of constellations going up, whether it's Starlink or other analogs. And I think what you're seeing is you're seeing global announcements of multi-thousand unit constellations, which brings up a lot of opportunities for how are you going to deorbit these, how are you going to avoid collisions, how are you going to track these tens of thousands of things in low Earth orbit. The last thing I want to say is it's really interesting that a crazy, talented entrepreneur can still have a fantastic impact. I was with Peter Beck last week in Auckland. Peter didn't finish high school, and he's built Rocket Lab into a fantastically clever, a successful company, faster than SpaceX to 50 launches. Their new rocket, Neutron, will compete very, very cost competitively. And they have just begun to build their own satellite constellation business. So interesting to see that one person in a very remote location can still be enormously impactful in an industry. All right, let's talk about a couple of things that are near and dear to my heart, which is things that fly. This is a problem. This is a giant problem in my view. We all fly on 737s today. If you're on, any major carrier, if you're on Southwest, if you're on Alaska, if you're, any mainline feeder, you're probably on a 737. It was designed in 1964. That is closer to the Wright brothers than it is to today. You have to contextualize that. Planes look the same for the last 60 or 70 years. All of the efficiency gains, like 99%, have come from advances in engine technology. Those are asymptoting. So what are we going to do? It is time for something revolutionary and bold. It's really, really hard to get the existing airframers to think about it, because they have backlogs of 8,000 and 9,000 planes running out, for the next decade. And so I think there's some really interesting things on the horizon. Jet Zero is a company in Long Beach, California. It's funded by the Air Force to build a full-scale prototype of a blended wing body. It's 50% more efficient with the same engines and the same fuel. The idea has been around since 1985 when Mark Page invented it at McDonnell Douglas. Mark Page is the lead aerodynamicist for Jet Zero. Comac in China has announced the same research effort behind ABWB. So it's one of these really interesting things that is actually happening. Scaled Composites is building Jet Zero, a full-scale prototype as we speak. You probably saw Boom flew the first supersonic flight of a civilian aircraft in a very long time the other day. On a personal level, I love Blake. I love the team. I'm not sure that supersonic gets you all that much in terms of reduction in time versus complexity, fuel burn, and a few other things. I do think hypersonics are very, very interesting, and they are coming. There are 13 companies that are well-funded right now building demonstrations that will get you point to point anywhere in the world in somewhere between 90 and 120 minutes. That's interesting. I wish Boom well. I mean, obviously we'd like to go faster, but the question is really, in my mind, is it enough? Drones. One of the things people don't really understand is that drones are here today. Google's Wing program, and full disclosure, I'm an advisor to Wing. They are partnered with Walmart. They are partnered with DoorDash. They are delivering millions of goods. It is insanely energy efficient. It is insanely cost effective. It is insanely convenient. I'll give you an example. A person ordered Advil who lived 4 miles from their Walgreens pharmacy. From the time they hit order to the time it was delivered was 2 minutes and 46 seconds. It uses less energy to deliver a burrito than it costs to cook a burrito, which makes way more sense than having a human being in a car show up. Zipline has quite literally saved, 500,000 people's lives delivering medicine all over the world. there are places where drones just make a ton of sense, and they are far more actively deployed than I think most people realize. If you happen to live in Dallas, for example, you can get almost anything that fits in a drone delivered from Walmart. China has embraced this idea of eVTOLs. There are tens of companies in China building eVTOLs of every shape and size and capacity, whether they're to fit in the back of a car or carry a great number of people or goods. It's really interesting to see, because that had been sort of the purview of the West since about 2010, but there's some really interesting things happening. The two companies that we're particularly high on are Autoflight and eHang. Both are fully licensed by the CAAC to carry people and goods. They are both really, really thoughtfully designed. The team behind Autoflight is incredibly impressive. In the US, there are really four people doing interesting things that are likely to be certified by the FAA: Joby, Archer, Beta. Joby and Archer focused on air taxi, Beta focused on cargo. Pivotal on the far right is interesting because it does not require a license and has no moving parts except the propellers. It fits in a single car parking space. You can buy one today for under $200,000. Likely to go into the EMS space. Very interesting model. Joby did something interesting recently, which is they put a hydrogen fuel cell in the back of the plane, and they flew at 500 nautical miles. Very interesting demonstration. I think you'll see the hybridization of eVTOL in a variety of ways happening throughout the year. Beta took their eVTOL and made a conventional takeoff and landing aircraft, the CX-300. Interestingly, they just made the first cross-country flight of a US-based EV or electric plane, flying from Burlington, Vermont to Santa Monica, California last Friday. And here's Pivotal talking about what they're doing in the EMS space, and they're doing a trial already in Southern California. Takeoff to curb in 4 minutes. Pretty interesting place, particularly if you're thinking about places that are hard to get to. Archer just signed a deal with Anduril. Again, one of the things you're going to see is, now that these companies are fairly mature, the defense industry is embracing this. You can understand, perhaps intellectually, why something that carries 5 to 6 people is quiet and flies a couple hundred miles an hour is of interest. And continuing to build on that defense theme, the defense world is really, really changing right now. And if you look at things that are changing, if you just have been following Ukraine, all you hear about is low cost, attritable or expendable devices that are asymmetric. And you're starting to see, $1,000 drone destroying $1 million tank, and you're seeing that in every domain. The other thing that we've noted is that, if you look at the public budget of China's defense policy, and you look at sort of where it actually is, the US and China are roughly on parity right now in terms of spend on defense. Defense is changing rapidly. You're seeing, the top left, you're seeing the traditional 6 prime contractors, and they are being disrupted by hundreds of small companies that are doing meaningful work. And some of them have gotten really valuable. Palantir today is larger than everybody except RTX, and they have 15 or 20% of the workforce. You're also seeing a giant relocation from sort of the middle of the country back to Southern California, which obviously had a gorgeous history with sort of the military industrial complex back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, that waned significantly and has been really benefiting from an enormous resurgence of young entrepreneurs moving in there, obviously anchored by SpaceX and Hawthorne. I'm going to quickly talk about what's happening in cars. Look, peak gas-powered cars has passed. And if you look at sort of where we're going, the charge towards electrification is sort of inexorably happening at the moment. On the autonomy front in the US, Cruise dropped out. Waymo and Tesla are still fully in it. Interestingly, I was talking to some folks in China. There are some people who have been testing against sort of comparable vehicles, and they feel like they are on parity as well. But interestingly, in San Francisco, people prefer Waymo. It's already eclipsed Lyft's market share. They've now partnered with Uber. They did 4 million rides in San Francisco last year. They'll do 9 million as they continue to expand cities this year. And perhaps most interestingly is that Waymo has a fraction, an 88% reduction in property damage claims for insurance. So even with Tesla's spotty performance in early versions of full self-driving, as they call it, and again, it has a much higher performance in terms of miles driven per accident rate. So autonomy works. It's not perfect, but it's definitely improving. The automotive industry is really going through a giant sort of catharsis right now. If you look at the left chart, which is sort of automotive company by market cap, obviously dominated by Tesla, but there's some huge Chinese companies, obviously BYD and Xiaomi and some of the others, and they are twice the size of Volkswagen, or Mercedes-Benz or General Motors for that matter. So there's a big change in what's happening. China has gone from 1% of car production in 2000 to 32% last year. But more importantly, 76% of EVs are Chinese. So they have gone all in on what I think is likely to be the successor powertrain, and they're changing things. And who's really suffering? Europe. And a third of the EU plants are at 50% capacity. Northvolt went bankrupt. There's a couple of VW plants that were shuttered recently. There is I think lack of real understanding or frankly flexibility to embrace what is happening. I'm going to finish up really quickly with some thoughts on energy. If you're going to electrify, if you're going to build out AI, if you're going to build out battery-powered humanoids, we need new power sources. And we are pretty unevolved on the Kardashev scale of like how we use and consume and manage energy. But there's a lot coming that is going to require a new modality. And if you just look at the chart on the left, which is number of data centers by country, we are building a ton of new data centers. We are filling them full of NVIDIA chips and liquid cooling, and many gigawatts of power are required. Eric Schmidt said, made a headline grabbing quote that we could run out of energy. But just to look at Virginia's interesting because it really is one of the first it was one of the original peering points, fiber nexus. There's a lot of data centers there because of it. 26% of Virginia's energy is for data centers. And that's why they chose Commonwealth Fusion to be the location for the first reactor. And on that subject, there's 50 fusion companies right now all over the world. Obviously, MIT is very close to a number of them, but this is something that feels inevitable. It still feels like it's a decade or so away from commercial viability, but it is definitely coming. This is also a global phenomenon. And if you look at we just threw this up there, Malaysia is adding a tremendous amount of power capacity to become the data center hub for Southeast Asia. And again, you're looking at how do you power this, and a lot of it is being driven by the tech economy. And so what you're seeing is, Amazon investing in small modular nuclear. Google has secured nuclear from a variety of companies. Oracle's building a nuclear powered data center. Microsoft's restarting 3 Mile Island. And Meta has announced a program as well. So you're starting to see unconventional funding sources out of necessity bring energy to the forefront. And then what I'm going to leave you with is that, again, China is rapidly innovating here as well. They are the leader in building new nuclear. They're also by far the leader in solar and wind. And Xi Jinping had targeted 1,200 gigawatts, and they hit that in 2024. So you're going to see huge increases in everything from generation, transmission, and storage. And it is because of this massive push towards an information economy, AI, and new forms of electric mobility. And with that, I will come off the screen and stop this breathless litany of slides.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. Let me add you to the spotlight here. Yeah. So let me start with a few questions and then give it to John for the question from the audience. There's a booming discussion in the chat. I can see a massive amount of discussion already going on here, there, Adam. So I'll start from the, Adam, as you notice, China almost like appears repetitively in your report. Almost every single demand topic, it shows up there, right? Yeah. For that, maybe I'll give you a two-part question. One is the ideal, one is the reality there, right? In the ideal sense, suppose the geopolitics is in a friendly, constructive fashion, where do you see China and the US should have collaborated? Yeah, what do you see as the biggest opportunity? The second one is, given the reality of the difficulty, right? What are the practical solutions or opportunity do you see both parties can engage with each other?
I'm going to start with the second one first, Jinhua.
Sure.
The practical reality is that there are going to be duplicative, efforts in almost every space, whether that's medicine, energy, transportation, space, because the geopolitics are, I think, crude and well-formed at the moment, and very blunt. So I think that the reality is that we are going to try and do things that China does well. China is going to try and do things that the West does well. And there's going to be a great deal of money spent, frankly, needlessly. In a more collaborative world, look, there is no question that China's expertise in advanced manufacturing and material science and a whole host of other domains, it eclipses what can be done, in the US today. And that would be a wonderful place where there are, opportunities to collaborate and share and, do things far more cost effectively. Sadly, the nature of security agreements and sort of the legal framework around things like CFIUS and ITAR make a lot of that incredibly difficult. I will tell you, at the individual level, I think when you speak with Chinese entrepreneurs or US entrepreneurs, they wish it were different. But, unfortunately, at the moment, it's not.
Right. Yeah. So the second question, it's interesting you started the presentation today from psychology, talking about this juxtaposition of the booming technology in the last 30, 40 years with a rather pessimistic turn in that, right? Yeah. Do you see this as a problem, or do you see that this is just a healthy reflection, people try to balance it? And if it's a problem, do you see any effort to counteract such pessimism?
There was a study done a couple of years ago, 2023, and I found it really, really troubling. If you asked children in 1970 what they want, what they aspired to do or aspired to be, the number one answer was astronaut, the second was doctor, and the third was firefighter. And these were like kids under 10. And they repeated the study in 2023, and the answer was TikTok influencer, YouTuber, Instagrammer. And that's broken. I mean, I think, how can you expect people to think about having an aspirational future if we're not providing the kinds of opportunities and educational experiences that are igniting people's imagination?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great example you give. Yeah, it really reflects where's the information acquisition channel the young generation get from this, right? Where's the aspiration, people that we used to have as respected heroes there. Right?
So here's just a really quick anecdote on that. At our most recent UP Summit, we partnered with SD's Rocket, the little model rocket company, and L3 Harris, and we put together a curriculum, and we taught 19,000 kids about rocketry. It was the largest single lesson in aeronautics or astronautics that had ever been taught in the US. And we did it over the course of 3 weeks. And then teams of 3 children each built a model rocket. And we set a world record launching 6,500 rockets over the course of a single day. And what I was hoping for is that, look, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 kids out of those 19,000 were inspired to say, I want to go to MIT when I grow up, and I want to study aeroastro. And I think it's that kind of things where you actually have to get tactile and in people's environment to kind of reshape the narrative.
Wow. Oh, that's an amazing effort. MIT in 2001 started this open courseware. That's a major effort to broadcast it, right? I think what you just mentioned should be continued and really broadcast to the much broader community to do this effort. Oh, thank you. Actually, you might talk about that specific effort in a separate session there, right? That's another question on the humanoid. You mentioned as a major trend there, right? Talk about the cost dropping down to like $1 per hour. For that, first of all, can you give me a few specific area of use case in transportation where you see humanoid can be used? You mentioned the oil field application, but anything,
Yeah, so I mean, look, there's a lot of people pursuing very prosaic applications of humanoids. So just moving material around in a factory or picking up parts for doing inspection. But, for example, in the oil field, the idea was, or frankly is, to put them on oil rigs and in the scenarios where there are dangerous or challenging situations where you need somebody to go and turn a valve when there's a fire or something, you send a robot, and that it both has higher temperature resistance or environmental resistance broadly, and you're not endangering somebody's life. So I think there is everything from the mundane in terms of providing support in hospitals, pushing gurneys. I mean, there's a lot of places where people do things that don't require a lot of skill, but require dexterity and the ability to fit through the environment that we have created based on our morphology.
In the chat, I think there are a couple of other questions related on the impact on labor market, employment, but I'll leave it for the Q&A part, right? I do want to talk about a little bit on the autonomous vehicle technology side, right? You mentioned that Waymo is already surpassing Lyft in San Francisco. Roboquaipo in Wuhan, China already has hundreds of robotaxi running around on this. One thing we did notice seems it's no longer technology issue per se, rather than economic business model issue there. Talk about cost per mile, efficiency, the operation, right? What's the latest in terms of the economics? Is it the case that once technology is solved, this technology will just quickly just penetrate, or is still kind of the cost-wise difficulty?
Look, I think you have to remember that, we all think of Uber as a ubiquitous thing that you use everywhere in the world, and you summon them multiple times a day when you're in almost any city in the world. And Uber consumed $31 billion before it made a dime of profit. I mean, so some of these things require a tremendous amount of capital to get to a place where they're unit economic profitable. And I think we are on the cusp of that with autonomy. I think tens of billions of dollars have been spent, that the corner cases are, if not completely solved, well understood, and can be mediated with a little intervention from support networks. And if you look at the unit economics today, they're better than having a human being in a car. So I think we have arrived at that moment, and I think it only gets better from here. It's not, and far be it from me, I'm not suggesting that it's perfect, that it's accident free, that it won't kill people, because it clearly will, but it will just do it at a rate far less than if human beings were operating machines.
Right. Yeah. Last question from me is that you mentioned that you didn't have time to cover the AI's impact on transportation demand. There are many different areas that it may impact. Maybe give us a few examples on that. What do you see?
Well, I think, you've seen a lot of work, a lot of concern recently, for example, around air traffic control. And there's been a spate of accidents and a lot of hand-wringing. And people are looking at those systems and realizing that they are 40 and 50 years old in some cases. I think there's a huge opportunity to bring AI into airspace management is one example. Another is simulation and training, for example. Today, simulation is pretty blunt. You have these simulators that are giant pieces of hardware that cost $30 million, that are relatively underutilized. AI can create scenarios using head-mounted displays for a fraction of that price. And they've already shown, both in research and commercial application, the efficacy is tremendous when you start to bring in evidence-based training as opposed to, rote skill repetition.
I see. Maybe a follow-up on the air traffic control, right? The air side and the road side have a very distinct school of thought. The air side is mostly a centralized architect, while the road side is distributed. You negotiate at the local level. But in the air side, with drones, eVTOLs, if the number of objects flying grow by 2 order of magnitude or 3 order of magnitude, probably we'll also have to change the paradigm there, right? So what's your view on the future of the air traffic control system?
Yeah, so I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a low altitude airspace, call it 300 feet and below, and for drones, and that will be a collaborative effort. That will be see and avoid, that will be acoustic detection, that will be ADS-B. It'll be an integration of a variety of things that allow different vehicles to deconflict in real time. That would be very different than an air traffic controller saying, turn right heading 070. There will be a low altitude piece that will be mediated by our air traffic control, call it 1,500 feet for eVTOLs and air taxis. And that will have to be seamlessly integrated with the flow of commercial airliners or military flying. But again, the number of flights per day, in aggregate, is relatively modest, and it's not compute bound, put it that way. So I think it's a very solvable problem. It will require policy leadership as much as anything.
Right. Yeah. Great. I'll give it to John for the question answers.
Okay, super. So thanks so much, Adam. Really thoughtful and dense commentary in the chat, and we will share the chat file with you. So I'm going to try to sort of summarize this and contextualize it as best I can. And I think there was a comment made by Sal Tannenbaum early in the conversation that I think is quite thoughtful and sort of captures many of the sort of directions of the questions in the chat. And you had mentioned that, we are sort of strangely or weirdly pessimistic. And he said, look, why is this weird? In the largest scope, the Industrial Revolution has resulted in a climate crisis. So worrying seems situationally appropriate. And I think if we kind of take a step back and we ask this really big question about the role of technology in making people's lives better, and we look, for example, at something like, pesticides. We created pesticides, but then, the insects became more resilient and sort of found ways around. We have these kind of system effects. We created nuclear energy, but as one of our participants pointed out, we really still haven't solved the question of nuclear waste storage. And for space, an area that's very close to you, I think Starlink has launched something like 7,000 satellites, which is like roughly half of the satellites that have been launched in history. And we do have this very serious problem of space debris that you pointed out. So I guess one way to think about this is, to what degree is technology solving questions and making our lives better versus creating new problems that we subsequently need to solve with technology? So how do you think about that?
I'm going to share a slide. I think it's the evidence is pretty incontrovertible here that if you look at, thank you for contextualizing it around the Industrial Revolution, because if you look at sort of the right side of this graph, you see, the Enlightenment and then the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at this graph, if you look at life expectancy or income per capita or percentage of people not living in poverty, it's better. There's no question that humanity is better off. You will also see that our capacity to make war and kill each other has risen equally quickly. So that is, perhaps more of a sociological comment and a flaw in our genetics that we like to kill each other. But it is, I think it is almost impossible to say that technology has not had a significant improvement. And what I would also say is, if you look at this next slide, which is sort of why it's getting better, if you look, this is sort of all of human history compressed into one really, really, really dense graph. And if you look at sort of everything up into the scientific revolution, where you had, the printing press and the first windmill, but everything that we think of as part of modern society, whether it's, the electricity, fertilizer, antibiotics, space travel, et cetera, has happened in the last 150 years. So my contention is that this trend will continue at the same sort of exponential pace, and that we will see both increases in longevity and increases in quality of life, assuming we don't all kill each other.
Do you have thoughts on how that narrative ought to be sort of better shared? I mean, you mentioned these great examples of like bringing kids and educating them and getting them to try to build rockets and stuff like that. I mean, how do you think about that? Like sort of, okay, if technology really is, if there is the case for technology, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily being made so well.
This is okay. So this is in the realm of personal opinion, John. I think you have to go back and really think about starting at the beginning. And what I mean by that is, like, you can't expect 25-year-olds to have a radically different sort of point of view than they do. But if you get 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds and you start to expose them to the idea that, math and science aren't a burden, and math and science are a door to a lifelong curiosity and opportunity, then maybe we can reshape things. So I think, and let me give you an example of that. When you go to India, and I was in India looking at a solar farm, and I was in the middle of nowhere, John, like dirt roads, kids, barefoot kids in raggedy shorts. And one of them came up to me and he said, he sort of pulled on me, like, it was like 99. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a venture capitalist." He said, "Oh, do you work for Sequoia?" I was like 400 miles from anywhere interesting. And like this kid knew that Sequoia was a great venture capital firm and that venture capital firms started cool companies and that he was going to work really hard in school and go do something that was amazing. And I think in the West, there is a sort of a sense of complacency that, you know, you didn't have to work all that hard, or you didn't have to engage your brain to its fullest capacity. And I really, really think that it starts with how do you talk to kids from a really young age. But that's my personal opinion, and I'm not an expert in the field.
I mean, and just in the 1 minute we have left, just returning to humanoid robots, you know, tell us a little bit more, and Jinhua touched on it, but the sort of, you know, how do you tell the jobs story, if you will, around that? Or are we casting the jobs narrative maybe in the wrong framework to begin with?
Well, I do think so, because there's a lot of jobs that frankly are horrible, that you really wouldn't want to do. I mean, and if you start with those that are necessary to be done, you know, the sanitation workers, sewage treatment, dangerous, you know, going back to the cleaning up of the world, remediating EPA sites, nuclear waste. There's a whole lot of things where people just shouldn't be on a daily basis, yet they are. And I think if you can economically and productively supplant those and retrain people, again, going back to the start with getting people to think about what you know, how to be an additive member of society, you know, in the future, such that they don't have to work for the lowest common denominator occupation. I don't think it's a jobs question. And frankly, I think, you know, look at the demographics in China, look at the demographics in the US. There's going to be more people over 60 than not in the US. So who is going to take care of all of those aging people? I just took care of my 90-year-old father as he approached the end of life. It is not fun. And I think there's a lot of places where automation can assist just the day-to-day exigencies of being a human being.
Right.
Thank you.
Sorry to interject. It's 1 o'clock. Adam, thank you for bringing such an array of technology innovations, but also more important, to inject a sense of curiosity and passion for the future progress here. Everybody, please join me. Thank Adam Grosser for the presentation today and the conversation.
You're all very kind. I'm overwhelmed.